It might seem unusual to begin any discussion of art by looking at two economists, but I'm an unusual kind of fella, so I want to introduce you to two men who have the most profound effects upon the 19th century. Karl Marx on your left and Friedrich Engels on your right. They're contemporaries in most ways. Marx was born in 1818 and Engels 2 years later. Marx himself was the son of two middle-class parents. He studied at the University of Berlin and then took a writing position as an editor of the Rhineland Gazette, which was a small local newspaper. And he began there in 1842, and he believed that working at a newspaper would allow him the opportunity to argue for social changes within that newspaper. He was eventually frustrated by his newspapers because sometimes publishers don't like editors getting too editorial in their editorials. And so he then moved to Paris and then to Brussels, where he continued to write. He met Friedrich Engels in Paris, and Engels had recently written a book called The Conditions of the Working Class in England. This was published in 1845. And it was a kind of philosophical paper. There's a couple of ways in which we could frame philosophy at this time frame, but there was a German philosopher by the name of Hegel, and Hegel perceived conflict and resolution in terms of ideas. But Marx saw them through the lens of economic conflict. And so Marx believed that it was the economic factors that caused division in society. And as a way to get there, I want to talk about the economic system of Europe through time, and then what Marx proposed, and then we'll talk about communism as a economic and not as a political structure. So let's begin with feudalism. The economic structure during the medieval era was that of feudalism. And just for the sake of today's class, I am going to be Lord Brian. I'm Lord Brian. I own this estate, and upon my estate live hundreds of people. Let's call them Steve. All of them are Steve and Stevette. So on my estate are all these people. I own the land. Steve doesn't own anything. And on my land, I've built living spaces for Steve, and they could be either utilitarian or really rough or somewhat acceptable. But those are mine too. And I let Steve and all the other Steves and all of the Stevettes live on my land, provided that they do all of my work for me. So this would be like, I have crops, you have to harvest them, plant them and harvest them. You do all the work for me. And you do this work for me because I allow you to live on my land. And if you don't want to do that work, well, I kick you off. And where are you going to go? You're going to go to someone else's land and they're going to kick you off too. So this was called feudalism. And it goes up the chain, right? So me as Lord Brian, I have people who serve me, but I also serve the next person up the ladder of servitude. And this has a good long history. But eventually some interesting things happen. And that is, and they're not all good things, I grant you. But in the relationship between me as Lord Brian and my workers, I have the power. I do. But what happens if I remove a third of the workers? The less workers there are, the more power the workers have. And I'll give you a good example of this. When I was applying for jobs, when I was finishing my PhD, I applied for 26 jobs in something like 18 different states. I really wanted to be an art history professor. I really wanted to be an art history professor more than what I wanted to be an unemployed art history PhD. And so as a result, I applied for every job I could. And so too did almost everybody I knew who wanted to be an art history professor. Now, the job I eventually, I was offered three jobs, I accepted one. right? Well, because I can only accept one job. And that that job received 119 applications for it. It's hard to believe, right? 119 applications for an assistant professor job at a small Catholic liberal arts school in Dubuque, Iowa. Now, when I applied for that job, the job kind of had all the power, didn't it? Because there were like 50 art history jobs in the country, and there were 800 people who wanted them. And I'm just making up numbers, but let's just say that's the case. And when you have more jobs or less jobs and you have people applying for it, the jobs have the power. And so what I mean to suggest for this is when it came time to negotiate salary for this job and they said, Brian, we want to pay you X. And I could say, really? X? I want X but 10, plus $10,000. And they could say, okay, I'll tell you what, if you want X plus $10,000, give me a week because I'm going to go talk to the second person who wanted this job and we'll see if they take it for X. And if they don't, then we'll come back and talk about X plus $10,000. But if they do, you're out of luck, buddy. And all of a sudden, X looks like a pretty big deal, right? That's the relationship between job and worker when there's more workers than jobs. But imagine if the exact opposite were true. Imagine there were 5 jobs, but only me who wanted them. Haha. So now I get all of them want me because they need the job done, and there's only one me. And so job number one says, we're going to pay you X. I was like, okay, X. And I go to job number two and says, job number one has offered me X. What do you think about X plus $10,000? They're like, well, we need to have the job done, so X plus $10,000 it is. And I go to job number three and say, hey, I have X plus $10,000. Do you want to make it X plus $15,000? And I do this until I reach the tipping point, and now I have a job that pays more. I don't have a different job. I just have one that pays more for me. And the difference between those two scenarios involves the relationship between the number of jobs and the number of workers. So let's go back to the Black Death. What does the Black Death do? The Black Plague. It reduces the number of workers. To be certain, the bubonic plague killed all kinds of people, but it's not surprising that it hit hardest in places where people lived in close proximity to one another, which was almost always the lower class, the serfs living on those estates. Because you live in a house with 20 other people. When you live in a house with 20 other people, when one person gets sick, everyone gets sick. When my kid gets a cold from daycare, I just get ready for life because I know that cold is coming to me. But if I live in a house with only me and 5 other people and I don't interact with other people, I might be okay. So why does all that matter? The Black Death kills a lot of workers. And in doing so, it provides in time those workers with more agency as it pertains to their job. Because now the same amount of work needs to get done, but there's less people to do it, which means a worker has more control. So feudalism in time is replaced with what you and I call capitalism. And in capitalism, people begin to own land and businesses. And in doing so, they have more agency as it pertains to their own economics. So what this means is rather than me being in charge of farming for Lord Brian, I can begin to have my own land. And then the success of my farm is dependent in part, of course, upon my own hard work, right? Of course, sunlight and rain and grasshoppers can all affect that. But now, the harder I work, the better off I might be. And imagine I'm a saddle maker. During the feudalism time frame, I make saddles um, for Lord Brian. But in the capitalist time frame, I make saddles and I sell them. And I can sell more. If I work more, I can sell more expensive saddles if I make better saddles. So in capitalism, we have a greater investment of a worker to do a job, do it well and do it better and do it more, And as time goes on, let's say I begin as a saddle maker and I make great saddles. My saddles are amazing. My saddles are works of art. My saddles are comfortable. They're lovely. Everybody wants a saddle. As a matter of fact, I am so popular. I have more people who want saddles for me than I can make saddles. Well, now I hire Bob. Bob and I are making saddles together. But because people want my saddles, a saddle from Brian, rather than a saddle from Steve, I pay Steve less than what I make myself, right? Um, People who work for the boss make less than the boss. And as time goes on, me and Steve earn up such a reputation that we need a third person and we hire a fourth person. And eventually now I don't work at all. Manny, Mo, and Jack make saddles for me, and I just sit in the corner, eat my macaroons, and drink my coffee. And now I'm the owner of a business, and I profit on the work of others. Well, let me tell you, Marx had heartburn with this, and he divides the economic classes of people into two different works: the bourgeois and the proletariat. The bourgeois were the business owners who took advantage of the workers and paid them a fraction of what their labor was worth. And so, as a way to get there, I'll give you an example. I am reading right now a memoir by Phil Knight, and it's fascinating. I love it. You don't know who Phil Knight is likely, but you know Phil Knight's product because Phil Knight is the CEO and founder of a shoe company called Nike. Now, I'm in the early life of Phil Knight when Phil Knight was working his hustle selling shoes out of his parents' basement. Really. But as time went on and as Nike became a multi-million and then multi-billion dollar a year industry, Phil Knight stopped selling shoes. Phil Knight started making money. And the people who made shoes for Phil Knight made a nickel on the hour and no bathroom breaks. And Phil Knight's got a really nice car. And Marx and Engels would suggest that this was a broken system. Now, let me demonstrate to you a little bit about this from my own personal life. In 2005, I was finishing my PhD at the University of Maryland and teaching a class at George Washington University. Maryland's about 4 miles outside Washington, D.C., and GW is right in the middle of the city. And so Tuesday, Thursdays, I would take the subway in to GW, and I would teach this class. Now, the tuition at GW in 2005 was $52,000 a year. It's kind of hard to believe, right? And let's say you take 6 classes a semester, which is a lot, right? 6 classes a semester is 18 credit hours. That's a lot. I usually took 15. But that means you pay about $4,300 per class. That $5,200 is only for tuition. Now, I taught a class with 144 students in it. And for the record, I've said this now for like 14 years. It's still the best class I've ever taught. My God, what fun I had with those kids. But I taught a class with 144 students. They paid roughly $4,300 per class, and that means my class generated for the university $624,000. GW University paid me $3,500 for that class. And I pause here to say, just because I'm not a math major and you might not be either, that $3,500 is less than $624,000. I did all the work, and my labor created this much revenue, and I got that much in pay. And Marx and Engels would have had an ulcer over this. Now, let me be clear. The university provided me with all kinds of assistance in order to do my job, assistance without which I could not have done my job, right? They gave me a classroom auditorium that could seat 144 students. They gave me computers in order to project my classroom. They had to pay for the building and the electricity and all of those things that go into it. But what Marx and Engels believed was that The labor should be commensurate with the revenue. He suggested that there should be a communal sense of pay, not a capitalistic sense of pay. And so what Engels and Marx suggested was an economic system, I'll say that again, economic system of communism. And that is the workers should be paid in relationship to the value of their good. This is different than than capitalism, in which the workers make a fraction compared to what the owner makes. So they actually called for a large-scale revolution, that the proletariat should rise up and overthrow the bourgeois. So I say all of this for a couple of reasons. One, whenever you hear the word capitalism, or pardon me, socialism or communism, know that those are economic systems. None of you lived through, you've all been born after the fall of the Soviet Union, but their economic system is communism. Their government is not communistic. It's not a government system, it's an economic system. And secondly, the other thing that's really important to know is that during the middle part of the 19th century, the tension between the lower class and the upper class was very much a part of the world. I gave you my German word a while ago, right? Zeitgeist. The zeitgeist of the middle part of the 19th century is very much about economic conflict. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848. 1848. I'll say it one more time, 1848, and I ask you to think about the relationship of that date to these two paintings by an artist by the name of Gustave Courbet. They're painted the following year. Now, of course, these paintings are not necessarily about economic struggle, but they do show a brand new economic class within paintings. If you think about the most commonly depicted people in this class so far, we're probably looking at Mary, Jesus, and St. Peter. But the only people who could afford paintings or portraits were the wealthy. As a matter of fact, the wealthy were the only people who could afford to commission art, and the art was very much about them in some way or another. But these paintings are not that. These paintings are something different. And Courbet, as an art maker, we describe him as a realist with a capital R. And so these works fit under that broad umbrella. And I want to show you a couple of details here. This painting is in a museum in Paris called the Musée d'Orsay, the Museum of Orsay. It's actually a converted train station. And this object is enormous. And I wish I had access to a picture I took when I first visited here, when I had my old school digital camera, because I got a picture of an entire elementary school field trip in front of this thing. It's like 25 feet long. It's like this widescreen horizontal format. And we can divide it into left and right halves, I think. On the left half of this painting, you can see that we have the clergy, right? We have the religious figures who are officiating this burial in the small French town of Ornat. And as a matter, we know who the person being buried is. It's Courbet's uncle. On the right-hand side of this composition, we have the local townfolk. We have those who are related or knew the man being buried. And so here you can see a priest officiating. We have a couple of kids here. These guys in the center part here, they're beadles. They're like low-level governmental officials, including one with a really nice nose. But there's other people present here. First of all, there's a dog, always a dog. But then think about this guy right here. That's the gravedigger. He's in the painting. I mean, he would have been there, but he's in the painting. I mean, the dog's there. it's a landscape of sorts, right? We have this hill in the background. We have a horizon line. It's a very high horizon line, not a lot of sky. And the only thing that breaks it is this single cross being worn by a person, being carried by a person who we can hardly see here. And we look at this side of the composition, the right side of the composition, you can see that the people who are shown are common, wearing threadbare clothing. They're not well-to-do. And isn't there a sense of commonness about this? I mean, there's a great line early in Hamlet where Hamlet, being the pity party thrower that he is, says something like, you know, I'm really sad. And Hamlet's mom, Gertrude, says, shut up. Like, your father's dead. His father died. That father lost his. So like, this isn't out of the ordinary. This happens. And then Hamlet says, I, madam, it is common. And then the mom, in the best clapback moments early in the play, says, if it be so common, why does it seem so particular with thee? Like, as if to say, shut up, Hamlet, get over it. People die all the time. You're going to have to rally like a champ and get over this. This is that kind of painting, isn't it? I'll tell you a story. In 2000 in 2001, December of 2001, on the anniversary of my mother's death, I went out to Arlington National Cemetery. And my mother was born in 1949. She grew up in the American Midwest. She was a good Catholic girl. And if you were born about that time and you were Irish and Catholic, you had great admiration for a certain president by the name of John F. Kennedy. I don't think anyone could have fought that urge. And so when I came to DC, 6 months before my mother died, she said, go visit the Eternal Flame for me, which is where Kennedy is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. So I did and took her photos and so on the anniversary of her death, I went out there. And it was a cold December day. And I grew up in Arizona. This was the first time I'd really been in cold since I lived in England. So I go out there and I'm at Kennedy's burial site, and I hear in the distance a 21 gun salute. And so it sort of hit me in a way that maybe it hadn't, that Arlington National Cemetery is a cemetery that is still working today. There's a good sporting chance that today there are 5 burials there. And so I walked around. I found a couple of other people, famous people who were buried there, and then saw a burial. And that burial had all of the things you see here. It had loved ones who will miss them. There was the color guard and the priests officiating. And it was a cold, gray day. And there was, in fact, a hole in the ground. You know what I didn't see there that day at Arlington? I didn't see any of that. And can I tell you what comfort that would have been to me seeing that on the day of my mother's death, right? Like, I have a general belief in the ever after, and the forgiveness of sins and all of that happy stuff, and how great it would have been to look up and see Jesus and Mary and Saint Peter and all of that stuff welcoming my mother up to the pearly gates. But that's not what Courbet saw, because if you've ever been to a funeral, I bet you've never seen that either. And because Courbet was a realist, capital R, realist, he said, show me an angel, I'll paint it. So he had this interest in painting the world exactly as he saw it. If it was there, great, paint it. If it's not going to paint it. He had an interest in truth, and the truth often involves people who are not well-to-do. For every person who drives a BMW, there are 10 who drive a Honda. And so why are we ignoring the Hondas of the world? So this painting, this enormous painting, showed not just middle-class people, lower-class people. And what does Courbet want to do with it? Let's just put it in a museum. And who goes to museums? Middle-class people, wealthy people. go talk to people who are on public assistance, and ask them when the last opera they went to was. And they're going to say, opera? Shut up. I'm worried about dinner. And some museums are free. The Louvre ain't. The Louvre's 20 euro. So if a mom on public assistance wants to take her two kids to go look at art, they're looking at 20 euro. Let's say kids are 50, 40 bucks, 40 euro, $50. Buys a lot of groceries. And so Courbet puts this in a museum and will be seen almost uniquely by wealthy people. Do you think wealthy people want to look at a painting that shows lower class people? Well, no, they don't. Made them really uncomfortable. And so this object here and then Stonebreakers on the right is a really, really important idea. So let's think about this image here on the left. It's called the Stonebreakers. The Stonebreakers. Now, I don't know what you need to score on your PSAT in order to be told that the job you really should be having later in life is busting up stones with a hammer in order to make cobblestone roads. But here we have those two guys. Here's Bob number one and Bob number two. And if we were to think about Bob number one, how old do you think he is? Because I would suggest to you that Bob number one is old. I ask students now, and they're like, he looks like he's 40. I'm like, shut up. He's not. This person's in their 60s, like, and the person next to him looks to be as if they're a teenager. So think about the continuity that's at play here. What do you think Bob number one was doing 50 years ago? I bet he was busting up stones with a hammer. And what do you think Bob number two will be doing 50 years from now? I bet he'll be busting up hammers. Look at their clothing, right? The torn sleeve, the ripped back, means they're wearing sabots or wooden shoes. You get the idea. There's their stew pot. This is a hard, hard job. And by looking at them, we can think about the ways in which this speaks to a continuity, that they will be doing this or have been doing this for an exceedingly long time. That's a really important idea. So Courbet does these paintings and they find some success, but it makes people uncomfortable because what he's doing is painting the lower class. And the lower class has never been an artistic subject, really. The same is kind of true here. And, we could spend an hour talking about this painting alone, but I instead just want to talk about its exhibition. Because to me, and for the sake of today, the exhibition is really important. This was painted between 1854 and 1855, and it was painted for the Universal Exhibition in Paris that happened in 1855. Beginning in the 19th century, we have an interest in what come to be called the World's Fairs. The first one was in 1851, and it was in London, the so-called Crystal Palace. 4 years later, France thinks it's its turn, and so they have their own. It's called the Universal Exposition, and because France is and always has been remarkably proud of its artistic past, they decide to feature art. So they have a juried exhibition, and that is art makers can submit art. The jury will pick the best. It will go in this exhibition, and the art makers whose art is chosen can rejoice because they're so fabulous. So this is a painting Courbet did for all of that. It was rejected. And Courbet, beginning in 1855, is kind of at the height of his French fame, one might say notoriety. And Courbet is so annoyed that he tells the jury that if they're not going to take this painting, they can't have any of his paintings. And the jury, believing that they really have the power over Courbet, they pretty much say, fine, forget you. we'll find another Courbet to hang in the exhibition. And if you don't want to be a part of this party, you're not allowed anyway. And so Courbet sort of gives them an obscene gesture, no doubt, and he decides to set up his own exhibition on the other side of the street from the official exposition. And you know what he does? He charges a nickel. He calls his exhibition the Pavilion of Realism. And because he was rejected, this change happened. If his paintings would have been hung in the regular exposition, they might have sold because they were for sale, of course. Um, but he wouldn't have made any money off of that. And instead, what he did was he rented out an exhibition space. He charged a nickel, and now he made money off of the people coming to see his work of art. This small little break, and he's not the first person to do it, but he's really the first person to exploit it. He goes from making no money to making all of the money. And what was funny is that the French world sort of began to say, well, Courbet's art isn't any good. Why would you go to see that? And as a result, people flocked to it. Of course, they wanted to go see the art that wasn't any good. We often flood to train wrecks. And so this painting was very much a part of Courbet's great success because now he made a nickel off of everyone who came to see his art. And that was a lot of nickels. And then he sold the paintings too. And so one of the real importances of this painting, it's called the Painter's Atelier, which means study, a real allegory of 7 years of my artistic life, is the ways in which Courbet flipped the exhibition system on his head so as to fully profit from it. And an artist who's going to do that as well is this guy. His name is Edouard Manet. And what you're looking at here is a painting he does in 1863. The one on the left is called Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and the other one is called Olympia. And these two paintings done in the same year are part of a really important year for Western art. And as a matter of fact, there's a great writer by the name of Ross King, who's written books on Leonardo. It's great. Michelangelo. It's great. Brunelleschi. It's great. Um, and a book he wrote was called 1863, A Year That Changed Paris. And it's about these paintings and the changes that happened from it. So I give you this image here. It's called Olympia. Olympia is, for lack of a better phrase, a prostitute. It's actually Manet's mistress. Her name is Joanne. Oh, actually, no, Victorine Murent. Joanne Heffernan is another artist's mistress. It's kind of a requirement, I suppose. And so it's this woman, it's Manet's mistress, Victorine Murent, and she has been posed in the nude as if she is a Parisian prostitute. Prostitution was legal in the 19th century. It was heavily regulated in terms of working conditions, health examinations, and what have you. And so here she is on this white divan, looking out at us with an African servant bringing her flowers. She's nude, wearing a choker. There is earrings in her ears, a flower behind one of those ears. And she is looking out at us with a sense of confidence and aggression that maybe is different than what we've seen before. Manet is a realist, and what I mean to suggest by this is he shows things that traditionally have not been shown within the history of Western art. And I could show you dozens of classical Greek sculptures or Renaissance paintings, or even those from the 18th century that show the female nude. The female nude is the greatest hit in the history of Western art, and almost all of those women lack something that all women have, and that's something called body hair. If you were to go only on the basis of Western art prior to 1863, you would somehow assume that women were waxed clean from their chin down to their toes. But of course, this is not the case. Women have hair under their arms. Women have like hair on their stomach. Women's Women have pubic hair, although that has not been traditionally rendered within Western art. This um, in the summer of 2018, I bought a rowing machine, and over the course of months, I watched 100 years of Olympic films. I think it was 39 Blu-rays. It was like 140 hours of movies about the Olympics, like documentaries. And one of the fascinating things was to watch the change in female like body hair on women over the course of the Olympics, because I can guarantee you that almost every woman in the Olympics in 2020 is going to have no hair on their legs, no hair under their arms, although, of course, both of those exist. But in the 30s and 40s, this was not part of our social world that women shave under their arms. And so, when looking at those Olympic films from the 1960s, like the 1960 ones in Rome, you're like, wow, women didn't shave under their arms now, but of course now they do. All of them do. So that is very much a part of all of this. Women were never shown that way, although here it is being shown. Also, think about the ways in which her body has been rendered. Isn't there a sense of flatness about her? Like, I get the idea if I can only get underneath her shoulder blade, I could like lift her up like she's a sticker. That there's no real sense of modeling or three dimensionality about this. She's flat, not three dimensional. And the fact that she's shown nude isn't so bad, but that she's been nude and coarse. I mean, it's really hard to be shown classy in the nude when you're wearing shoes in bed, honestly. I mean, so they haven't, so Manet has not gone out of his way to hide her position as a prostitute or as a nude woman. He is actually emphasizing, he's calling attention to it. I mean, for crying out loud, there's a woman bringing her flowers, presumably from her next client. I mean, that she's a prostitute is good enough. We don't need to be reminded that there's a monetary transaction involved with it. And because Manet took his art history class, he puts not a little puppy dog there, but a screeching black cat. I mean, you just don't have to be an iconographer, a study of symbols to realize what cats symbolize. Like, cats symbolize bad luck, bad things, like evil. So when we looked at this, darn it, we could make fun of her 5 extra vertebrae on her back, but we could at least say the following. She might be a prostitute, but at least we don't see the client's wallet and change purse. And at least Aang could paint a body that had a sense of three-dimensionality about it. To say nothing of the fact that she's kind of looking somewhat demurely out of this. But Manet sort of turned all of those conventions on his head. He's like, yep, prostitute, three-dimensionality, don't care. And to say nothing of the fact that I'm going to work within a tradition of depicting the female nude, just like Aang and Titian, but I'm going to flip it on its head. And that's a really important idea. I'd like to show you another painting from 1863. Another painting that shows the exact same subject matter, and another painting that was wildly popular. This is Alexander Cabanel's Birth of Venus. It was also done in 1863. So let's talk about the importance of this year, 1863. 1863 was one of the years, again, of the annual French Salon. And during that year, the French Salon decided that they were going to have a smaller show, that rather than let in 800 paintings, they were going to let in half that many. And so the submissions remained the same. The number of submissions remained the same, but the number they accepted went down by a factor of 1/2. And what this meant is that a whole lot of artists who traditionally had numerous paintings accepted in this show either had fewer paintings or none at all. And some of those artists were livid. Now, let's also talk about who jurors these kinds of shows, because the people who jury art shows are often the really old and stodgy. Like, trust me, the older you get, the more traditional your tastes are. Um, when I was in college, I worked as a DJ at a roller skating rink. And I remember when doing this thinking, I don't think there's ever going to be a point in my life where I don't won't care about music that's happening now. And it happened. Boy, it happened. It happened when I was in my 20s. And the music I buy now are by artists who are getting older, who I've liked for a long time, or great music that I didn't acknowledge when I was a teenager. So I bet if you were to look at the CDs I bought last year, there it's more music from my mother's age. Like I bought a $200 set of the Beatles, but I don't care about, oh, the guy who died recently, who I had never heard of before. I guess he's a big deal. Um, is it Nipsey Russell? Nipsey Hussle. I don't have any Nipsey Hussle, right? But I did buy the Beatles. So what I mean to suggest to you is that jurors of a music exhibition right now, they probably care more about the Beatles than Nipsey Hussle. And as a result, Nipsey Hussle had to find a different avenue to become successful. And so artists like Manet, they were rejected from this show. And they threw such a temper tantrum that the French government needed to have two exhibitions. They had the regular exhibition, and they had what was called the Salon to Refuser. The Salon to Refuser. The Salon of the Refused Paintings. Which do you think was better? Which do you think was more popular? That's a different phrase. Um, when my first year out of graduate school, a movie came out at least sometime during the year called Snakes on a Plane. Now, I'll be honest, I've never seen the movie Snakes on the Plane. There's no way possible that Snakes on the Plane is a good movie. It doesn't mean you don't like it. It doesn't mean it's not very good. And when this movie came out, it was totally ripped apart by every critic who had the spare time to go see it. And did people go see a really bad movie? Yes, they did. And I bet some people went to go see a really bad movie because they heard it was a really bad movie. And this is the exact thing that happened with the Salon to Refuser. People were told, oh my goodness, this movie is a train wreck, and people went to go see it. And the exact same thing happened with the Salon to Refuser. This became remarkably popular, and so much so that there were a number of artists who were a part of it. And I want to talk about one of those guys because here he is. This is an American artist, although it's weird to call him an American artist because he's born in America and he studies at West Point until he's expelled. But he eventually goes to France, trains under the same teacher who taught Manet, who we just looked at, and then settles in England and paints there for the rest of his life. His name is Whistler, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and you're looking at two of his paintings, Symphony in White number 1 and Symphony in White number 2. Now, that title, Symphony in White, was given by Whistler himself. So I want to talk about the word symphony. What is that word? What does it suggest to you? Because there are other words that Whistler used within his paintings. He had symphonies, nocturnes, arrangements, and compositions. And all of those are musical words. So one of the things that Whistler wanted to do was not title objects in a way that suggested a sense of narrative. So we call this the white girl now, but that's not what Whistler called it. Now, this painting is in the National Gallery of Art, and when I gave tours there, I would often ask elementary school kids, okay, look at this painting. What's the story? And kids are great at this. They're great at making up stories because they'll say, well, her name is Rebecca, and Rebecca is wearing a wedding dress, and she has a flower, and she's shown really sad because on Wednesday she found out that Bob, her fiance, has been sleeping with Susie, her best friend. And now on her wedding day, she stands on this bearskin rug in front of this white curtain, and she just doesn't know if she should go ahead with this wedding because she knows that this man is a bad man and that he's gonna cheat on her his whole life and that she will be miserable and sad. And so she's left at this crossroads of whether or not she should go forward for this fate that is clear as day, or whether or not she should bail and run away and go be with her first boyfriend, Roberto, who is an airline mechanic at United. That's what they do. It was awesome. And Whistler would say, yep, none of that. None of that. It's merely about form. And way back when, my friends, do you remember? Form versus context. What do you see? And then I would say, always said, and I care about the what does that mean part. And Whistler would say, this painting is all about form. It's not about anything else. It's all about form. Like, all about form? Really? Well, what does it mean? Like, it doesn't mean anything. It's all about form. Yeah, yeah, okay, it's about form, but what does it mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything. She's not wearing a wedding dress. That's not a bear. It's merely the pleasant, I hope pleasant, arrangement of color and line and balance and value and harmony and shape together as a way of speaking about form. There's no story, there's no narrative, there's nothing to be learned. It's all about a pretty picture. And you're like, shut up. Really? It's all about form? And Whistler said, yes, it's all about form. It's why I didn't call it the angry fiance who just broke up with Bob after he found out that Bob was sleeping with Susie and she's running back to Roberto, the airline mechanic. I called it Symphony in White. It's just a composition of color. Right? Damn. How's that possible? How can this be about nothing but beauty? Because that's kind of the exact opposite of what our historians think, right? We think about these things in other kinds of ways. I'll give you one more Whistler painting, and then we'll sort of wrap up realism. This is a painting that's in Detroit. If you're ever in Detroit and you should go, it's worth your time. It's called Nocturne in Black and Gold. That's Whistler's title for it. We call it The Falling Rocket. It was painted in 1875. And if you aspire to be an art maker, I have a story for you. Whistler completed this work in 1875 and then put it on display in a gallery, the Pall Mall Gallery, for a price of 100 guineas. So let's talk about that word guinea because you might not know it. British currency rotates around the pound, the shilling, and the pence. So a pound is comprised of 20 shillings. So you can think of a shilling as being like a nickel, and a shilling is 5 pence. A guinea is a kind of made up British currency that is not 1 pound. And again, 1 pound is 20 shilling. A guinea is not 1 pound. A guinea is not 20 shilling. A guinea is 21 shilling. 21 shilling. It's 5% more than a pound. Now you pay in pounds, right? Like there's not a guinea banknote. But what it is like a cost of a thing with a built-in tip. Does that make sense? Like if you tip 5%, then that it would be a tip. The things that were traditionally priced in guineas were things that only the wealthy or the affluent could afford. So if you wanted a carriage, it would be priced in guineas. A fine suit would be in guineas. A loaf of bread would be in pounds. A, a, like right now I have on a collared shirt, right? Like a polo shirt would be in pounds, but a handmade broadcloth dress shirt, that might be in guineas. So in putting this in guineas, Whistler was signifying something about what he believed the value of his art and art more broadly was. That it was something refined, something elegant, something elite, something for the wealthy. Now, if we look at this composition, it looks, and I haven't used this word in a long time, it's a big word. Let me see if I can remember how to spell it. Okay, good. It's abstract. Like there's a certain level of abstraction of this. You can kind of make out some parts of this composition that are sky. You can sort of make out somehow the firework or the falling rocket. You can make out bank of the River Thames. You can perhaps make out some boats. So there was a man who was the Slade Professor of Art at oh golly, I forget if it's Oxford now or Cambridge. I'll go with Oxford, but I'm not sure if that's right. The Slade Professor of Art at Oxford, his name was John Ruskin. John Ruskin was an art teacher and art critic. John Ruskin's favorite artist was Frederick Turner, who we looked at last time, the British Romantic painter. And Ruskin was essentially the voice of the art world in Great Britain during the second half of the 19th century. If John Ruskin said it was good, then it was good. If he said it was rubbish, then it was rubbish. And so Ruskin wrote an article about, or an article that was a review of this exhibit. And during this review, he talked about this painting in particular. And I'm going to paraphrase now because I don't have the article in front of me. But he said something like this: I've seen a whole lot of crazy stuff in my day, but never have I seen anything as crazy as a charlatan charging 100 guineas for throwing a pot of paint in the face of the public. Now, Whistler, who didn't style himself a charlatan and who believed that he was an art maker, took offense in a couple of different ways. One, the guy called him a name, and I know that seems like a very easy thing to do now. I mean, I think I don't want to get political, but I think about the way in which President Trump calls people names, which just seems like, regardless of politics, maybe beneath the office. But back in the olden days, calling someone a name like this was quite literally fighting words. And so he calls the guy a charlatan. That's not a nice thing to say. I mean, like, that's actually a horrible thing to say. And then the second thing he said is that he's thrown a pot of paint on this canvas. And so Whistler did what any good American would do. He lawyered up and sued Ruskin. And so this thing went to trial. And Ruskin testified, and he had an art maker friend who was sort of like a famous art maker who's kind of forgotten now. His name was Edward Burne-Jones. They both testified about how this was not a very good painting. But Whistler, determined to see this lawsuit through, he testified too. And during cross-examination, Ruskin's attorney said, "How long does it take you to knock off one of these paintings?" And that was the phrase he used, knock off. And Whistler, who kind of believed he was smarter than you in any case, said, "Well, I knock it off in a couple of days. The first one is really to get the majority of the painting done, and the second day is to really finish it off." And the attorney said, "You think 100 guineas is a fair price for 2 days' work?" And Whistler said, "No, I don't think 100 guineas is a fair price for 2 days' work. I think 100 guineas is a fair price for a lifetime devoted to learning." Drop the mic, leave the stage. You don't pay him for what he does. You pay him for what he knows. I'll tell you a true story. In the not too distant past, I got strep throat. And after a couple of days of feeling like hell and then looking in my throat and seeing those little whitey things back there that are not so pleasant, um, I came to the conclusion that I had strep throat. Now, let me be clear. I'm not that kind of doctor, but I think I had figured it out. So I went to urgent care. Um, Now, I, as an employee of the magnificent state of Louisiana, have a certain thing called health insurance, and I have a copay. My copay is $25. But if I did not have health insurance, it would have been a lot more. So let's, for the sake of today's discussion, let's pretend I don't have health insurance and I'm paying things out of pocket. I go to urgent care and I say, I'd like to see a doctor. I think I have strep throat. And they say, good, how are you gonna pay? And I have a big stack of cash next to me and I hold it up and I say, straight cash, homie. And they say, awesome, have a seat. We'll get a doctor to see you in a second. And I go in there and I say to the doctor, hi doc, I think I have strep throat. And they say, well, why do you think that? I'm like, you know what? I got little white pussy things on the back of my throat. My throat hurts. I feel tired. I kind of feel like hell. So I think I got strep throat. And so the doctor says, okay, hold on. I'm going to go get on a rubber glove and I'm going to get a popsicle stick. And they do both those things. And he or she says, open up. And I say, ah, and they look in the back of my throat. And she says, yep, absolutely, you have strep throat. My physician then writes me a prescription for amoxicillin. They give me a high five. They say that will be $800 or $500 or whatever it is before my insurance, and away I go. The physician did for me exactly what I already knew, and that is I had strep throat. They wrote me a prescription, which I need because I can't get a prescription for amoxicillin in the United States without that. In Italy, I could, but there I can't. And I ask you, did I really pay the doctor for what they did? Because what they did involved putting on a rubber glove, getting a popsicle stick out of a container, asking me to say ah, and then writing me a prescription. Those were the things that they did. They didn't tell me anything I didn't already know myself. And that cost me hundreds of dollars. So did I really pay them for what they did? Or did I pay them for what they know? I paid them for medical school. We get paid for what we know, sometimes as much as what we do, right? Um, I teach art history, and I can tell you that teaching art history is not the most laborious of jobs in the world, right? Um, and there are people who work harder physically and maybe even longer than I do. But instead, what I get paid for is I get paid for 13 years of college and 13 years of being a professor, right? Like, there's not a lot of people who can load up a PowerPoint and talk about art history for almost an hour without notes. Like, that's what I get paid for, not for the art of talking. I talk for people free all day. And I've been talking to you for 30 hours now. Like, it's not talking I get paid for. I get paid for what I know. And I know all that stuff because of like a whole lot of school and a whole lot of experience. And Whistler was saying the exact same thing. You're not paying me just for the thing I make. You're paying me for all of the things I've ever had to make in order to make the thing you're looking at now. This is how I always encourage our art makers to frame their artwork. It's artwork, not art free. And you're not just paid for what you've done, you're paid for what you have learned and all of the time it's taken you to get there. And Whistler was saying the exact same thing. The judge ruled on his side. Now, to be honest, he got a fraction, and by a fraction, I mean a minuscule fraction of what he was seeking. Essentially, the judge says, you're right. Ruskin shouldn't have said those mean and naughty things, but I disagree with the ways in which it has injured you financially. But Whistler articulated something that every art maker should be thankful for, and that is art is not merely about the object we've made, but all of the work it has taken us to make that object. And from here, we get to Impressionism.